Welcome to Integrated Insights with ICCG. For more than 30 years, our team has partnered with small business owners to prepare for and navigate the business transaction process. Pull up a chair as we share stories and insights from our experience on all sides of the M&A table.
Well, welcome back, both Grant and Dave. Thank you for joining us again today. I know we had technical difficulties last time, but we did talk about what is important to a seller last time, right? And when we talk about deals, we're mostly on the sell side, and so what's important to sellers is important to us. But we are also on the buy side, right? And we know even when we're on the sell side, we still talk with buyers, and so we always have to know what is important to a buyer. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I know that there are a couple different types of buyers. Let me run through them. One, strategic buyer, right? And that is your, Grant, why don't you give a little bit of a short explanation of what strategic buyer is?
Yeah, a strategic buyer is typically one that wants to integrate an existing business into or with the business that's the target. And so it could be vertically integration, it could be just adding customers to their own products or adding new products to the existing customers. It could be geographic. In other words, right now, a lot of people want to be in Texas because it's boomtown compared to some of the other Midwest states. And so it could be a strategic move to open up a business in Texas. And so all those things we would kind of couch under this broad heading of a strategic buyer.
I think one other differentiation for the strategic buyers that they typically would have a management team in place, where that's very different from an investing buyer who most likely does not, and is wanting the team to come with them, or the strategic may want the team to come with them, but they've typically are wanting to have control over the operations.
Yeah, and that leads to our second type of buyer, which would be the financial buyer, is what we call it. I think you said investment type of buyer, and essentially that is a private equity outfit, right? Private equity group, venture capital firm, or family office, whatever you call it. It's a financial sponsor, if you will. And so, but they're most of the time they're not coming in to actively run the company most of the time, right? Would you say that's correct, Dave?
I would say that majority of the time. I think that oftentimes, though, you're going to find the financial buyers coming in and turning maybe into more strategic buyers, because if you use the PE groups as an example, and one of the things that most of the groups are trying to do is they're going to buy a platform company. So they're looking for a platform company, one that is got the quality, one that may have the management in place. So as they start tucking in other ones, they're going to have their own management team, most likely, maybe from a high level in place, or looking for additionals along the way. So it's not quite as the differentiation begins to, and look, is one PE guy that we really respect, has many, many years in this, said, make sure everyone knows the motives are very, very clear. Everyone's motive is clear. It's one, and that's to make money. And so,
Yeah.
So everyone's got that financial interest, even if they're a strategic buyer.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so strategic buyer, financial buyer. Let's focus on strategic buyer. What would you say is important to a strategic buyer?
I think, every industry is different. I was having coffee this morning with a principal of a firm in an industry that has different metrics than, let's say, a manufacturing company. And this was in professional services. And so we walked through some of the metrics that are important to strategic buyers in that space. And they're different than maybe those that are strategic buyers in a manufacturing or fabrication kind of space. And so strategic buyers understand the industry. They're not just looking at the financial statement. They have specific requirements. It might be product related. It might be revenue model related. It might be customer related. We don't want to do that kind of work. We want to do this kind of work. And so the buyer comes with a paradigm that the seller needs to either fit into, or it's not going to be attractive to that buyer, regardless of price. And I think obviously, the match between the existing company and the target is super important. And sometimes the strategic buyer is looking to diversify. Sometimes they're looking for exactly what they have already, because they can put their arms around it, just in a different geography.
They may be looking for a strategic in the vertical as well. So perhaps they bought some sort of construction company. Now they want to start. Maybe it's the material supplier that they're using specifically in that construction or whatever, or something that's going to be used in the future in that same industry. So right now we're seeing a lot of home services being bundled together. So the strategy they have is to not just buy a heating and air conditioning company, but to buy the plumbing company, to buy the electrical. So they've got all the home services in one. I know up where I live, I was just researching one that was family owned a few years ago. And now it's, it's been pulled into a big conglomerate. So I started digging in and kind of wanting to find out what they did. That's a big kind of strategic right now.
So you guys, and you've previously kind of mentioned that you kind of did a towing roll up, right? A towing service roll up. And so what was important to you when you were looking at a towing company? What was really important to you when when you were looking at buying this company?
So just to make things clear for those who are listening, I called these guys, we were the white hats of towing. There were the white hats and the black hats of towing. We weren't the repo guys. We weren't the guys who were pulling grandma's car off the side of the road for, parking 3 inches into the red zone. It was all municipal contracts and things like that. With that being said, I'll let Grant answer that question.
Yeah. Anytime that you are doing a strategic buy, generally it's going to involve remote management. And that is very difficult, both in your own location, in your head office. Basically, it's very difficult for people to remotely manage. And then on the flip side, some people respond to being remotely managed differently, right? Roll-ups, if you want to call it that, have failed consistently because people are not used to being remotely managed. They don't like the people up in the head office, and so they kind of go rogue. And so people are super important, and you have to go in there with the very clear intention to create culture. And I would say, in businesses like that, where it's so capital intensive, you're looking for, equipment that'll enhance your offering across the board. And so we've faced that in manufacturing companies just recently, where there's a lot of robotics. And so a company who has a great customer base, but not the latest robotics equipment, could be bought by somebody who has that capability and be able to serve those customers way more efficiently and not have the problem that everybody faces today, and that is the lack of skilled labor. And so I think those kinds of things were super important to us. But at the end of the day, we realized pretty quickly that people are important.
I think what Grant's getting at here is I think successful buyers have a lot of wisdom, and they know when to do something, when not to do something. They know when to mesh cultures and not. That was a great example of cultures. We tried to put literally two different companies together in a dispatch situation from two different parts of the Metroplex, and they were so culturally different. They'd been run so differently that it just didn't work. We had to finally, instead of trying to make culture happen, we had to honor the culture that was there and
Hmm.
kind of work around that. So we ended up, dividing it back up and letting the two cultures handle it. And it was much better. It's more expensive to do it that way, but it's more than about saving money. It's about, in the long run, it made money because we had
I
better
think
cultures.
Dave, if you remember, we struggled with the emotion in those purchases, and here's the reason: because you want to grow really badly. You see that the other company across town, let's say, has something that you really want, that you and sometimes buyers make mistakes. Making an emotional purchase rather than taking care of the right due diligence processes and making sure that it's a really good fit. Emotion goes a long way in a buying decision, and you just got to make sure that it doesn't rule the day, that you are not overlooking some of the red flags just because, oh, look, I'll be twice the size, or I'll have this much equipment, or I will be able to dominate and be the number one guy in town. You got to be really careful that you don't make an emotional purchase.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so one of the key things is people and culture, right? So that was important to you. Now, in I know Dave, you and I talk most of the time in our deals. We talk to the buyers for the most
Right.
part, and so I know that always doesn't always come out, and it also may come out and it may not be true. And so a lot of times we just focus on the
Yeah.
financials. So how do you tell that that's important to them, truly important to them?
Part of our job as intermediaries is really asking those questions and asking those hard questions. When we interview buyers, we're looking for a couple different things. And I think it's important for potential sellers that are listening to understand is, there's a lot of different motives out there. And I think we're seeing a lot of really, really smart buying groups out there. And I think there's really been a shift. I think people really are starting to care more about people and families and not so much about the bottom line, although those are out there. And I think we try to flesh out in these interviews with buyers things like, have you retraded deals a lot? What's your record on retrading deals? We're very specific. They don't like that question. And retrading, for those who are listening may not know, retrading is just simply coming back later in the deal after diligence is done and just trying to renegotiate the price based on. And oftentimes we've seen in certain circumstances where it was planned to be retraded the whole time. And I think that's what gets irritating to both us and a seller. We'd rather walk away from those kind of buyers, honestly, rather than try to go through that. Now, a lot of times it's very legitimate, and we've been on the buy side before, and we've retraded deals, but it was fully understood. And we get into, we start looking at certain metrics and we let those be known in the letter of intent, and we get into the diligence and it's not so much that way, then I think there's an expectation that it will be. But that's a little different than just, you know, people signing a whole bunch of LOIs and hoping one sticks and then start retrading,
Yeah.
which you see a lot,
Yeah.
unfortunately,
I
with
think,
some of the private equity
even when
people.
we represent buyers and sellers, so when we represent sellers, the seller is also interested in what the business is going to be post closing. I know they're interested in what they take home and all those kinds of things, but there is a desire that the business succeeds, and I think for it to succeed, um, you have to, as intermediaries, we have to talk to buyers and make sure that it is a culture fit for that business, because we've spent a lot of time getting to know the seller. And we kind of know, hey, this buyer is not going to be a good culture fit. And so we kind of warn the buyer, or we warn the seller. And those conversations are not always easy, but our job is to make sure that the deal succeeds, not just to close, but after close.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think one of the things that's stuck out there, and it's so key for us to dig into the historical record of the buyer, right? And just to kind of see what's your experience. How have you dealt with this problem? I know I remember having a deal with the big fence outfit. We going with a private equity group that we had asked them, hey, there's kind of an issue, or not issue. There's a dynamic here with a couple of employees. How have you dealt with that in the past? And they kind of gave their record, and that I think really gave us a little bit of a comfort level. Okay, they care about these things. That shows a little bit more of what they're what's important to them, right?
Yeah, and they didn't make such a big deal about it. I mean, they said, yeah, that's an issue, but we can make it through that issue. And I think the red flag for me is when we're dealing with the buyer, and everything that comes up that may not be a positive, that may be seen as a negative, they start really punching on that. And that's when a retrade's coming, right?
Right. Yeah.
Rather than saying, oh yeah, we dealt with that in one of our other companies, this is how we handled it. That's just not a big deal. That's an experienced buyer, right?
But I think Dave, you've always said bad news doesn't get any better with age, and so just painting a realistic picture, not an aspirational one, is super important for both parties to the transaction.
Right.
The seller doesn't need to promise that everything's going to stay the same. I mean, and the buyer doesn't need to promise the same thing. I mean, things are going to change. And, it's just, those are the kinds of things that the earlier you get it to get it on the table, the easier it is to predict the end result. Because if there is hair on the deal, getting that hair on the table from the beginning, creates a less likelihood for retrading.
Right.
Yeah.
And the seller thinks they're never going to be able to find someone if they do that, but it's totally the opposite. I think buyers appreciate knowing the hair on a deal up front. And that's part of our job, is to get that. What isn't fun, I will say this, is when a seller doesn't tell you something and they know it's there and they find it out in diligence or whatever. That's when it isn't fun, because it's those, all the possible sellers are listening. It's better to disclose early on, because it's going to be found out.
Right. And when we represent buyers and we go in and we find something out that they have not told us, what do? We look for the second thing. Right?
And the third and the fourth.
What else are you hiding?
Right.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that it is critical, right? Even more so than just important. It is critical to understand as you say, the hair on the deal, right? The things that could go wrong. It's important to understand them and put them out in the open pretty early on. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Andrew, before we sign off here on this episode, I did want to say this, because we may have people that are listening that are possibly going to sell. Maybe they're looking at, we've talked to a lot of people are going, well, I might sell, but I might buy a couple more first, or I might buy a couple local people that I want. We've really, we did a lot of that last year. And actually that's kind of fun, because it's different than just representing the seller, but it's when we're representing a buyer who's just a one-off. They're not a PE group. They're just a really good company owner, and they just want to get bigger through acquisition. And those are kind of fun, because we sit down with them and we talk to them. This is what we need from you as a buyer, and this is, help us be strategic with this. And then we go and we search and we find and we become that person, that intermediary who's going to talk to the people that they know they want to purchase. And we've done several of those this past year, and I think they're really fun to do personally.
Yeah, I think even this morning I had a conversation with a guy that, that's where the conversation led. It's, hey, I can't get what I want. And I said, well, the one way to get an increase in purchase price is to increase the bottom line. But another way is to make the bottom line cross one of those thresholds where the multiple is greater. So we know that a $5 million EBITDA is going to sell for a greater multiple than a $2 million EBITDA. We know that. And so how do I get there?
Well, I know that we could talk for days about what's important, because there are a lot of things that are important, and we can get really into the weeds of things, right into the details, and get lost in it. So I know we're always happy to sit down with anybody to talk about those details and answer any questions. So but that's what we're in today, and so thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And that wraps up another episode of Integrated Insights with ICCG. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories from our team. We love hearing from our listeners. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please send us an email in the show notes. For more information about ICCG, please check us out on our website or follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Until next time, there's always a seat at our table.